Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Season 2 of Lost. This is part of the series of videos I'm doing reviewing the different seasons of one of my all-time favorite TV shows, Lost. Spoiler warning for the entire series as I talk freely and openly about what occurred throughout the show's entire run, so if you haven't seen the entire series, you may want to go watch it first before watching this video. So I'll begin the review by being completely upfront that Season 2 is by far my favorite season of Lost. I think they just got the formula completely right this season. Everything that I think made Lost great is illustrated in the events and the feel of this season. And they had they simply stuck to these themes and the feel through the later seasons, the rest of the show would have been much better off for it. In fact, many of the flaws that occurred later in the later seasons I can point to as being a result of straying too far from the feel of Season 2. That being said, this season isn't perfect. It does have its own mistakes and downsides. However, I just feel that they are far outweighed by what they got right this season. So let me go through it chronologically, starting at the beginning, which gave us the greatest opening scene to a season in the history of the show, in my opinion, where after waiting for the second half of Season 1 to find out what was in the hatch, they spared no time diving right into it and showing you the hatch from the get-go. Of course, as you're watching and you have no idea where you are, most people like myself would assume it's somebody's flashback. But no, it's actually inside the hatch, as we find out with an awesome reveal of Desmond looking up through a viewfinder at Locke and Jack looking down into the hatch. And then the season is pretty well paced from there, as there's a couple episodes down we learn about the purpose of the hatch, which turns out to be centered around a 1970s style computer in which you must enter a code into it, the code which just happens to be the same numbers that gave Hurley bad luck every 108 minutes, or the world will end. And they give you just enough information to keep you interested, but also withhold enough to keep you guessing, to keep you mystified, and that right there to me embodies everything that makes Lost great. That makes it unique. A mystery that seems absurd on the face of it, but is actually intriguing and ties into some of the characters' backstories, as the numbers are an important part of Hurley's backstory, and the man who is in the hatch pushing the button is someone who appeared in Jack's past. So that right there are elements that makes the show great, that they forgot about in future years. Intriguing mysteries on the island that tie into our main character's own character stories, thus making the combination of island mythology and character storytelling the show abandoned in its final season, and I talked about that in my Season 1 review. I heard some people refer to Season 2 as the season that they just sat around a computer pushing a button all season, and I couldn't possibly disagree more. In fact, I would say that for the majority of the season, the button didn't even feature prominently, and it's just a background thing, something that's always there looming over them. But it does feature prominently again at the end of the season. Which brings us to another major component of Season 2, that is the introduction of the tail section survivors, which I thought was brilliantly handled, with them being introduced as Michael, Jen, and Sawyer were thinking that they were the others, so you were thinking that they were the others. And then it was very exciting and nicely done. Plus, the other 48 days just really cements them for us, where we get an entire episode devoted to the backstory and how they got along since the plane crash. I love how it's an alternate version of the story we saw in Season 1, done in one episode. However, I question a little bit how it's the focus is more on the others, a lot more than Season 1 did. They never really explained why the others bothered them so much more than the fuselage survivors. And don't tell me it was because they were geologically closer to them. That's ridiculous. It had to be much more than that. Of course, I know the real reason. It's because the writers didn't think of the others until partway through season 1, and even then they weren't ready to focus on them entirely. But in season 2 they wanted to focus on them more, which is why they were more involved with the tail section survivors, and that's really all there is to it. Plus, I think Ana Lucia's character was poorly handled at the start. They wanted her to be, appear antagonistic in order to create tension, but they took it too far, and they ended up alienating her from audiences who eventually ended up hating her. Personally, I love the character of Ana Lucia and thought she brought a very interesting dynamic to the group of characters, and I liked how she bonded with Jack, and they were sort of the two leaders that came together. I'm a bit frustrated that they killed her off, as I thought she would have been really cool to have around going forward. But I heard that Michelle Rodriguez only agreed to be in the show for 1 year, but I say if that were their only reason, they should have just got somebody else to play her who would stick around longer. But I suppose they thought they'd be okay because, hey, we still have Mr. Echo to stick around and the audience likes him much more. Little did they know the actor who played Mr. Echo would end up quitting at the very start of the next season. And plus they killed Libby, meaning the only survivor of the tail section group was Bernard, a relatively minor character, making the whole tail section thing kind of meaningless to later seasons, but oh well. But I would even go as far to say that I liked Ana Lucia better than Juliet, and would rather have Ana Lucia stick around to the final season than Juliet. But I think it's because, personally, the one character trait I really can't stand is arrogance. And Juliet was so arrogant and acted like she knew more than everybody about everything, and that just pissed me off. Whereas Ana Lucia had this vulnerability about her where you could tell her rough exterior was just a facade to cover her feelings of inadequacies, which I found fascinating. But where the season faltered was with Charlie's character. From the beginning, they kind of botched this by creating this ridiculous storyline with Charlie being all jealous of Locke forming a relationship with Claire. I mean, come on, the show has one love triangle, it really doesn't need another. And then playing at Charlie having the heroin, is he taking it or isn't he? They never really answered that, and I just found the whole idea of him just keeping it around to feel comfortable bullshit. If he's going to do drugs, have him do drugs. If he isn't going to do drugs, then have him not do drugs. None of this ambiguity bullshit. I think the writers of Lost need to learn that ambiguity doesn't always work. They seem, sometimes they need to learn not to use it. Anyway, the writers themselves even admitted that they didn't really know what to do with Charlie because there's only so much you can do with having an addict relapse and then recover and then relapse. It gets old really quick, which I think is why they killed him off in the next season. And the only way they were able to make him interesting for that season was to create a storyline about his impending doom. But this season, the debacle with Charlie led to one of the all-time worst episodes of the entire series, Fire and Water, where they seem to just throw all the character building they've done for a season and a half in the garbage and just turn everybody into assholes for some unknown reason. Particularly Locke, who doesn't at all act like Locke in this episode. However, I thought they recovered from this nicely with The Long Con, which was an outstanding episode that was like, hey, just a wee little reminder, Sawyer's still a con man. And this was great because we actually got to see him pull his con on the group, which played into the Jack-Locke struggle that they've been building all season, which I think worked really nicely. So they paid off the horrible Charlie episode by making Charlie's new hatred of Locke mean something as he teamed up with Sawyer to humiliate him. I actually enjoyed it as I thought Locke deserved it. Then we get the introduction of Henry Gale, who in later seasons will come to be known as Benjamin Linus. They did sort of drop hints throughout that he was manipulating them, so it seemed obvious he was another. They created some really great tension with him. The only thing I would say rewatching this season now is that his character doesn't quite match up with Benjamin Linus's character they created in later seasons. Now, even though there's nothing concrete that directly contradicts it, it just doesn't feel the same. He doesn't strike me as the leader, more of an underling. I know you could say that this was because he was pretending to be an underling, but yeah, nah, still not buying it. And the ending of the season was absolutely phenomenal. I would say one of the greatest moments in television history was when Michael killed Anna Lucia and Libby. That shocked the hell out of me and was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I was not expecting that at all. Even though it wasn't nearly as tragic, I would say it was Lost's Red Wedding moment. I personally found it much more shocking. It was just amazing how they didn't show you what happened to Michael when he went after Walt until the second to last episode, and they had flashbacks to show you what happened to him and how he ended up killing Libby and Anna Lucia. It was just amazing. And the end, and the main thing later seasons should have learned from season 2 that they seemed to have forgot was how great they were at answering questions. Not only that, but tying into events that occurred earlier and were never explained into the current plot. The last 3 seasons kind of sucked at this, and season 6 really sucked at this. But in this season, we got an amazing episode where Claire started to remember her time with the others, and finally got some answers on where she went and what happened when she disappeared. We found out why the hatch light came on after Boone died when Locke was banging on it, and it turned out to be very significant to the present day storyline. We find out who Boone was talking to on the radio just before he died. We find out what the Nigerian plane was, what the background was that, and they made that relevant to the present day storyline, and all the interconnections and the flashbacks, how Shannon was at the same hospital Jack worked at, someone Saeed met turned out to be the guy who was in the hatch pushing the button with Desmond. Desmond actually met Libby before, which is how he got the boat that made him, that he took, that how he ended up on the island. All this and much more led to lots of crazy theories and really got people's imagination going. Was another thing that really made the show great, really made the show unique, really made the show talked about. And they just abandoned this in later seasons, which was a huge mistake. But finally, I'll talk about Desmond and Live Together and Die Alone, which, if you've seen my Lost Top 10 episodes, which I'll leave a link in the description below in case you haven't, you know this is my favorite episode of Lost. To me, this embodies everything that made the show great. Even though The Constant would go on to become a huge fan favorite, this is the episode that first made Desmond an incredibly interesting character that people grew to love. Because this was an amazing, emotionally charged story. Seriously, after Desmond was introduced in the first 3 episodes of the season, I thought he would just become like Rousseau, another character running through the jungle that we run into from time to time. I didn't realize he would return in a big way, and his backstory would be the backdrop of the most phenomenal season finale ever. Everything about this episode was great, but most of all, the way they tied Desmond's backstory into finally explaining what the hatch was, and it was amazing. And of course, they didn't explain outright what the hatch was. They did so in an ambiguous way that left a lot of questions. But this, unlike some things they do in the future, was handled perfectly. We at least got to see that Desmond was correct, and the world indeed would have ended if you didn't keep pushing the button, or at least some sort of doomsday scenario would take place. And by the way, I did think the revelation for what the button really was really nicely handled in future seasons. However, I think the end to this episode was with Penny's involvement wasn't explained satisfactory in future seasons. All they explained was that Penny was looking for Desmond. Yes, of course, but if looking for Desmond involved looking for some electromagnetic event and having these two guys camped out in the Arctic somewhere, how the fuck is that all connected? And it's implied she knows a lot more about the island, which we later learn that her father has a long relationship with this island. You might think maybe it's through him, but this all sounds like a great story to tell, yet they never told it. Why? Who knows? But in any event, I absolutely loved the shocking reveal at the end with the two dudes in the Arctic station. It was amazing. Even though it wasn't followed through with properly, it still really worked for this episode, as this is the first time in the show we actually see current day events take place off island. So my overall rating for season 2 out of 10 is a 10, the best. Although I did say this season had some flaws and isn't perfect, I think it's as close to perfect as any season of television can get, and thus deserves a 10. So that's it for my review of season 2 of Lost. You should check out my channel for more videos on Lost and subscribe to keep up with future season reviews, and thanks a lot for watching.